Kia ora koutou. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Audit and Risk Subcommittee meeting. This is the first Audit and Risk Subcommittee meeting of this term of Council. Welcome, everybody. We do have quite a busy agenda today, and I'll take you through that. First of all, I would just like to make everyone aware that we do have two councillors sitting with us in the meeting today who are observing, so welcome also to Councillor Dyer and Councillor Tupu. You're very welcome to observe. So without further ado, I'll just ask everybody just obviously to remind themselves that the emergency procedures, which are coming up on the screen in a second, I'm sure you know them all very, very well, Mr Mayor, councillors and staff, but just in the event of an emergency, please obviously follow the directions of the staff. I would also like to welcome any public that members of the public that might be watching the live stream on Council's Facebook page. And it's my pleasure to invite Councillor Briggs to please take us through the opening karakia.
My pleasure, Chair. Do feel free to join in as well. We'll put it onto the screens so everybody can see. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kine ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hiaki ana te atakura, he tuo, he hoka, he hauhu, ti hei, mauri ora.
Thank you very much, Councillor Briggs. I've not received any apologies for the meeting today, and also no public comment has been requested. So we'll move into item 4 on the agenda and just ask, we do obviously, Mr Mayor, councillors and myself have all our interest declarations up to date through our Democracy Services team, but just ask if there's any item on today's agenda that may give rise to a conflict for anybody that is a member of the committee. I'll take that as no. Thank you. Okay, so we are doing a slight change in order of the agenda too, Mr Mayor and members. We're moving straight to item 6 on the agenda and coming back to item 5. Item 6 on the agenda is our external audit update, Urban Plus Limited, which is the parent and the group, which is on page 53 of the agenda pack. And I'd like to invite John Whittle from Audit New Zealand, Daniel Moriarty, welcome, who's the Chief Executive of Urban Plus Limited, and also Darren Newth, the Financial Accounting Manager, to speak to the report. So Darren, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to present the report for the year ending June 22, the management letter, which is attached to Appendix 1 to this report. So I suppose the key points to note is that the annual report did have an unmodified audit opinion. And during the course of the audit, we did use some external specialists to provide some additional advice when preparing those accounts. Most of that was around the asset revaluation, which we obtained advice from Aon New Zealand Limited. Also noted in the report was an additional paragraph around paragraph 4.1, which talked about some of the classification and associated accounting treatment for the construction contracts that Urban Plus Group are entering into. So it's getting quite a complicated area that we obtained advice on, and we'll be using that framework going forward. And during the course of the last year, we also closed out the remaining 2 audit points that were in the previous management letter. So we've made some good progress on that in that regard. So I'll hand over to John, whether you wanted to add anything more, or Dan.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything more from me. That's fine.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you, John. Daniel, is there anything you would like to add or comment on?
Nothing further. Just to excuse me. Just to relay my thanks for Simon George pre his departure for his work, but also for Darren and Jenny's team just with their support working through the process. Greatly appreciated from myself and the board.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I'm sure they appreciate that acknowledgement as well. And I'm sure the officers would like to, no doubt, acknowledge your team's support as well, because it is a mutual effort to work on these things. So thank you. Mr. Mayor, members of the committee, I'll open for questions if anybody has a question. No? Thank you. I'll then put the recommendation in front of you, and that is that the subcommittee notes the Audit New Zealand's management report on the audit of Urban Plus Limited Group Annual Report 2021-2022 as attached as appendices 1, 2 and 3 of this report. May I have a seconder, please? Thank you, Councillor Salinger. Is there any member who would like to speak to the motion, please? No? Any member would like to speak against the motion? Thank you. I'll then put the motion. All those in favour say aye, against say no. Thank you. I'll then declare the motion carried. Thank you very much, Daniel. Appreciate that. So we're going to continue, Mr. Mayor and members of the committee, with all of the audit papers, and then come back to the other papers so that we can let John get back to his no doubt busy day. So the next item on the agenda is item number 7, which is also an external audit update. This one is Seaview Marine Limited, and that is on page 93 of your pack. I'd like to, obviously John is there, Darren is there, and I'd like to welcome Tim Libgard, who's the Chief Executive of Seaview Marine Limited. Welcome, Tim. Thank you for joining us. Darren, I'd like to pass back to you just to introduce the report, please.
Great, thank you. So again, this is the report for the year ending June 22. So again, the company received an unmodified audit opinion. So again, there was a valuation included in this round. So again, we obtained advice from Aons as producing those numbers. There were 2 additional matters raised in this year's audit, which brings a total of 4 matters that are outstanding. Those are summarised on your report from paragraph 9. So there was some performance reporting matters that were raised. So that'll be included in this round of surveys. So we'll be hopefully be able to close that out by the end of this financial year. There was a missing letter of appointment when the chair was replaced. Again, we will be issuing a letter in retrospect for that appointment, and that will hopefully close out that matter as well, and any subsequent appointments to the board. We've been keeping documentation on that. In relation to the 2 new matters, so the approval of the chair and the chief executive expenditure. So we're currently working through a process at the moment to tighten up the controls around that area, and so hopefully we'll be able to report back our next round about how those are being closed out. And similarly with the approval of the expenditure outside financial delegation, and I think the key matter to note there is that the issue that was raised was actually an approval by the previous chief executive, and Tim is fully aware of the current requirements, and so we're hoping to be able to close that matter out as well. So I'll pass across to John. And
There's nothing further from me. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Tim, is there anything you'd like to add or comment on?
No further comment from myself. Just let everybody know that things are tracking to be resolved, and I appreciate the work of Hutt City Council Finance and Audit New Zealand throughout this process.
Thank you, Tim. Appreciate that acknowledgement. Mr. Mayor, councillors, I'll open for questions on this report. Does anyone have a question they would like to ask? No, thank you. And I'll put the recommendation in front of you, and that is that the subcommittee notes the Audit New Zealand Management Report on the audit of Seaview Marine Limited Annual Report 2021-2022 as attached to Appendix 1 of this report. May I have a seconder, please? Councillor Briggs, thank you. Is there any member who would like to speak to the motion? No. Any member who'd like to speak against the motion? I'll then put the motion. All in favour, please say aye. Against, say no. Thank you. I'll declare the motion carried. Thank you very much for joining us, Tim. And we're not going to let John and Darren off just yet, because we're now going to move to the external audit update for Hutt City Council, the council itself, and that is on page 112 of your agenda. Jenny, would you like to speak to this report, or it's Darren?
Yeah, I'll give Darren a break and I'll speak to this one. Okay. First up, just in terms of the overall result for the audit, it's a good one. We're really pleased with it. Unmodified audit opinion, and I'll go through that in a bit more detail shortly. Just for the new members of the committee, I did want to comment that overall the management report that we got back from Audit New Zealand, we're really pleased with it. And over the last 3 years, there's been really good progress in closing out audit management points. So, you know, we're continuing along that track. In terms of the audit opinion, there were the water activity performance measures issues, which we've had in the past, and those continued. And in terms of the management points, we've got 4 open items that we're still working through. 2 of them we expect to have closed out in the next audit. So that's the annual review of network rights. Lyndon assures me that that's to be closed very, very soon. And in terms of the item around the segregation of duties in our financial system, I know that one's definitely resolved. There's 2 other items that will take longer to resolve. IT disaster recovery, and then the Wellington water performance measures, hopefully those go away with the transition in the new water entities. Okay, so there's 3 new items. One relates to the revaluation of the 3 waters assets and some of the challenges around that whole asset revaluation. There's 2 items relating to the regulatory area, building consents and resource consents, and we've got Alison Geddes here, Director Responsible, if you've got any questions related to that. So I will hand over to John. Maybe John, do you want to talk through any of those items? Maybe the 3 waters assets potentially. That was a real tricky piece in the revaluation this time round.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. In terms of the evaluation, I think we did, for the current year, we did do a couple of extra processes, including looking at neighbouring councils and other councils around the country in terms of, I think the key for us with these valuations is the unit rates that are applied by the valuer, and to make sure that those are within, you know, the replacement costs that council is having to pay for new assets. So we did see quite a variation across neighbouring councils, as well as around the country. There can be a number of different reasons why unit rates might vary. We also explain in the report that we also saw some level of variation against recent contract replacement costs. Again, there's a number of reasons that could factor into that. And going forward, to make the whole process easier for everyone, including the external valuer, would be to scope that into the terms of reference for the valuation to be completed, that you know, there's clear reconciliation in there or evidence to substantiate why certain unit rates have been adopted and how do they compare. I think that exercise with neighbouring councils is useful, to then bring Wellington Water into it as well, because they'll have oversight of all 6 of the councils to be able to be satisfied that overall it looks reasonable to them as well. And then that will make, and then the last part of that would be against the recent replacement costs, you know, to make sure there's evidence on all 3 of those areas are covered off. In terms of the performance measures for building consents and resource consents, it was the first time we've audited those as material measures, and we likely will audit those going forward. We know there's a lot happening in the space, particularly over the last 6 months that council is doing towards improving its systems and reporting. The recommendations we've made here, we'll follow up quite early in the audit. Again, it was an issue that dragged quite long in terms of our audit process last year, and something we'd like to cover off as part of the interim if we can. So we'll arrange that with management. Probably the only other part of the report we would draw your attention to, it's some ways around the new standard that's effective for the current year, and that's PBFRS 48, which will give council additional reporting responsibilities around its performance measures in the annual report. Again, as part of our planning, we would like to see an impact assessment from council provided to us as to how it's thought about the impacts on its performance measures, and making some of those disclosures around particularly some of the judgments around those measures and why they are in there. and we can give our feedback as well as part of the interim, if necessary, to make sure there's compliance with that for the current year's annual report.
Thank you, John. Is there any additional comments, Jenny or Darren? No? Thank you. Just before I open for questions, Mr Mayor, councillors, just like to pick up on something that Jenny mentioned. There has been a lot of work done in closing out historic audit issues, certainly since I've been involved with council. There has been a lot of work done. I've been involved, a lot of oversight with Jenny and her team. So that is in a very good place. And the matters that John has just commented on, particularly with respect to valuation of water assets, is something that is a challenge for every council in New Zealand. So really, we're not alone here on this. So now open for questions. Mr Mayor, councillors, are there any questions of either Jenny, John, or as Jenny said, Alison is here too if there's a question on the specific building consent area. Councillor Salinger.
Just a quick one, probably for Alison. Just referring to the item number 3 on page 115, which is to do with the resource consent processing days. Just keen to get a bit of an indication as to when the review and the corrections are likely to have been attended to.
Through you, Madam Chair. The actual review has been done and the fixes have been put in place, although I think in the resource consents area we've still got some IT problems we're still working with. We've done a thorough review of the invoicing system, and we're actually working on those, working out what discounts we're going through all of those consents that have had discounts, and we will be refunding people if necessary. So we're actively doing that now.
Thank you, Councillor Salinger, and thank you, Alison. Are there any further questions? No, I'll then put the recommendation in front of you, and that is that the subcommittee notes Audit New Zealand's management report on the audit of Hutt City Council Group Annual Report 2021-2022 attached as Appendix 1 to the report. May I have a seconder, please? Thank you, Councillor Barrett. Is there any member who would like to speak to the motion, please? Councillor Salinger.
Simply to congratulate Jenny, the other finance staff, and as well as the business owners and managers for all the work that's been done in addressing the issues and getting what really are very clean reports in terms of areas for improvement from the auditors, and also to thank the auditors for their work throughout the process. Very impressive.
Thank you, Councillor Salinger. Certainly, I'm sure not only Audit New Zealand, but also the council officers appreciate your acknowledgement of that. Is there any member who would like to speak against the motion, please? No, I'll then put the motion. All those in favour say aye, all those against say no. Thank you. Declare the motion carried, and thank you very much, John, for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, Darren. Mr Mayor, councillors, if we could go backwards, please, at the start of the agenda, and we'll now go back to item number 5. Trust you appreciate we wanted to allow John to get back to his day, so that's why we took all audit items first. Item 5 is the recommendations of around the Treasury Risk Management Policy Review and Update, which is on page 11 of your agenda. We do have some external guests joining Jenny, who's going to introduce this report, being Brett Johansson and Cameron Scott from PwC. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. Jenny, I'll pass to you to introduce the report, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Okay, so this report is about an update to the Treasury Risk Management Policy. I'm going to ask Brett to talk through the proposed changes just at a high level. Before I do that, I just want to quickly make a couple of comments about the broader strategic context in the report. This morning, the Council, through the LTP Annual Plan Subcommittee, we've been looking at annual plan and looking at financial projections and debt levels and so on. So just connecting this policy piece to that piece of work that's ongoing as we navigate through these tough economic times and higher borrowing costs and a lot of cost escalations we're having to deal with. Also, just in terms of the Three Waters reform, there's a mention of it in the report. We're meeting on the 9th of March for our first meeting with DIA to negotiate through the debt allocation and that settlement process of our balance sheet and what's going to happen. So, that process is just kicking off, and we're pretty hopeful. Things are looking pretty organised in terms of the way the process is going to go, but there's a lot of uncertainty as to exactly where it's going to land and what the outcome will be. So just keeping you informed there, and we will obviously also be, we'll be doing more regular reporting around the Three Waters reform going forward now for the next year as we lead into that reform date on the 1st of July next year. So now, and the other key piece, just linking into other aspects, the Policy, Finance and Strategy Committee on the 8th of March will have the quarterly Treasury performance report presented to that committee as well. So that'll go through all the details around the latest Treasury debt levels and interest rates and so on. So we won't be dealing with that now. We'll deal with it at the committee meeting. So hand over to Brett and Cameron to talk through the policy changes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here today. Yes, no, we completed the independent review of the Treasury Risk Management Policy the end of last year, and our overall observations are it continues to be sound and consistent in our view to sort of best Treasury management practice and peer policies as well. So in terms of the risk approach that you're taking, the objectives that you're setting around your Treasury management, the limit framework, it's consistent with the Act and also good practice. We have made some slight changes. One was in the debt funding maturity limits. We've just increased that limit in that 3 to 7 year time band to 85%, and that just gives you a bit more flexibility in terms of managing your debt portfolio over time. But nevertheless, the limit system is still consistent with that overall objective of spreading and smoothing your debt maturity profile, requiring you to have a minimum amount of debt maturing in the 0 to 3 year time band and the 3 to 7 year time band. And it's consistent with other council clients that we are working with. The other points and changes around the policy is more just to provide greater clarification in terms of how the policy is implemented. By way of example, and certainly again giving the group CFO a little bit more flexibility around thinking through interest rate risk management and the ability to look at various debt scenarios, debt forecast scenarios to help in terms of informing those risk management decisions, particularly with the likes of Three Waters ahead of us. We did do a peer council analysis, so we looked at a group of councils not too dissimilar to Hutt City, and just looked at your borrowing limits that you have within the policy, and our comment would be they remain sort of conservative to other similar credit rated councils, particularly your debt servicing ratios as well. So I think it's good just to do that benchmark to see where you're sitting, and obviously those limits will form part of the way that you're starting to think around your financial strategy as you get into your LTP workshopping exercises. So I suppose those are the sort of high level comments around the policy. So no fundamental changes in the policy construct, and we think it continues to serve you well in terms of the ongoing management of your liquidity, debt and interest rate risk you've got across council. Yeah. Any comments? You all right? Yeah. So, yeah, happy to take questions, of course.
Thank you very much, Brett, and thank you, Jenny, for the introduction. Before I do open for question, just a couple of comments I would like to add. Just picking up on a point Jenny made around the Three Waters uncertainty, and particularly with respect to the debt calculations, those are extremely complex, and they will take time to work through. Also, you may be aware that the submissions to Select Committee, the second round of submissions are being considered literally now, by DIA, by Treasury and other officials to provide further advice back to Parliament on exactly some of the challenges that have been raised. So that also will need to be factored into the work that you're doing on your debt calculations. The other comment I would make, and the new new council members of the committee may or may not be aware that I was the Auckland Council Group CFO. So it's Treasury management policy, and particularly with respect to how PwC guide that, is something I know very well. And to that extent, I don't just receive your committee papers and look at that. Jenny and I and other officers do quite a lot of work offline. So I have also had a very close look at this policy before it came back to you. There were one or two recommendations that I made in addition to PwC that Jenny picked up as well. So what you have in front of you is a collective effort of not only the officers, PwC, and input from people such as myself. So with that said, I'll now open for any questions that you may have. Councillor Briggs, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, for your collaborative work with our colleagues to ensure we got the policy to where it is. Just picking up on page 17.21 under consultation, with the intent to have this policy obviously be updated to reflect the changes post the water reforms and going out for consultation as part of the long-term plan. Was there any kind of notes or priorities kind of picked out what this policy may change into post reform, noting that obviously our balance sheet will look a lot different and our debt will look a lot different as well? Or do the guiding principles kind of stay as is when we go into next year's long-term plan?
Are you able to respond to that, Tenny?
I'll start because I'll do the easy part of the answer. I think my understanding and my expectation is that largely the principles and the rules and controls that we're putting in place and our risk management approach there will stay in place. Obviously, our balance sheet's going to change dramatically. You know, we're going to lose a third of our assets and revenue is going to move. But in principle, around how we're managing our treasury risks, those fundamentals will stay the same. And Brett obviously sees a lot more organisations and has that broader perspective, so he can add some further, I'm sure.
Yes, I think the overall requirements under the Act in terms of the risk approach, a prudent financial manager, they remain unchanged. And so the key objectives that you're trying to achieve around your treasury function, they won't change as well. The limit system that you have at the moment has got the flexibility to be able to manage different sort of forecast scenarios. So I think the flexibility is there, but also maintaining that risk framework, which is there at the moment. So I wouldn't see wholesale changes. I think what's important with policy and its implementation is just having the flexibility to be able to make those strategic decisions within the framework. So we generally don't find frustration in the limit system. A lot of the sort of effort goes into the quality and timeliness and accuracy of forecasts, particularly debt forecasts, and that rolls down into capital work programs and the delivery of those. So those are probably the bigger challenges that we see across the sector. But generally, we're finding that the limit system absolutely has got the ability to cope with those sorts of changes, which are probably more the inputs into the strategy decisions that you make within the framework of the policy. Yeah.
And if I may just add as a follow-on, also just thinking ahead, you know, when we start the LTP and get, you know, working through that through, you know, August, September, October, November, and we've got better information around Three Waters reform outcomes and understanding what our work program looks like, excluding Three Waters, we'll be definitely testing our policy and seeing, does it make sense? Do we need to make any adjustments? And if we do make, you know, need to make some changes, we'll obviously come back to council and look at options, and we'll include it in the consultation. Not this detailed policy, but the financial strategy and the long-term plan will be included for consultation.
Are there any further questions? Councillor Salinger.
Thank you. This may be somewhat of a hypothetical question, because I would agree with the time to look at limits and so on, as once we know what's happening with our balance sheet and revenue post the Three Waters being locked in place, so to speak. But I'm just interested in thoughts on our limits I found that the graphs, the tables that show the peer councils versus the LGFA limits very interesting. I hadn't seen that info before. And just wondered if there's any comment on a suggestion that given the major pressure we have on our budgets now, particularly capital to fund water infrastructure and so on, we may still have similar pressures post changes and roading and so on. In that kind of scenario, would there be any good reason not to simply adopt the LGFA limits as a number of other councils have done? I recognise it's a less conservative approach, but just interested in any general comments on that.
Brett, would you like to comment first, please?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Brett, go ahead, please.
Oh, yes, oh, okay. My observation is that that councils generally are conservative relative to the LGFA limits, borrowing limits, because once you reach those limits, there's no place to go really in terms of liquidity management, debt management. So typically you're finding councils are conservative in setting particularly that net debt to revenue limit relative to the LGFA's borrowing covenants, and using that more conservative limit to drive the financial strategy decision making. So it's in some ways cutting the cloth slightly a little bit sort of tighter than what those sort of covenants are. So there is a little bit of scope, shall we say, should there be unforeseen and unknown events that happen, and we know that it is always an eventuality. So typically you'd have a haircut, as we call it, or a buffer amount just sitting in there as knowing that you've protected yourself in terms of your long-term financial management. Yeah.
Thank you, Brett. I think Jenny would like to add something. Councillor Stillinger, and then I might add something else before we, I think you have another question coming.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to quickly add, I suppose so that's a broader scope from Brett, and thinking about our own circumstances and our own, risks that we're carrying. When we're setting those limits and thinking about the limits, while it may be quite tempting just to go up to the high limit, the LGFA limit, and keep it simple, I think it does help with some of the discipline around managing some of the risks. So, a weather event, having that bit of buffer, and keeping the limits a little bit conservative in our context where we are, there are a range of risks for us. Particularly Riverlink hasn't happened yet, those, and so on. So, yeah, so we've got to look at that broader picture and understand there could be a range of reasons why we actually do decide to keep them a little bit conservative. And sorry, with the Riverlink project, I meant the stormwater banks not being built. Yeah.
So, thank you, Jenny. Just to add to that, Councillor Stillinger, just a couple of points. Agree completely with Jenny's response to you that holding a bit of a buffer is always a prudent thing to do, because it doesn't take an awful lot of risk movement, whether it's an interest rate or an unforeseen event, to actually push that up. Secondly, the LGFA calculation is to sustain a AA credit rating, which is quite important to them globally because they issue New Zealand dollar bonds on the global market. It also is a bit distorted because it includes part of Auckland Council's debt, not the offshore. They're the only council in New Zealand that can borrow offshore in foreign currency in their own name. So that all of those things get into calculation, but it's certainly prudent, particularly in this environment, to maintain that buffer.
Thank you, and I would agree with all the comments made. It is a good approach. My other question, hopefully it's a fairly short one, and you touched on it in your response there, Madam Chair. My question was to be, what is the association between those LGFA limits and the view of Standard & Poor's? Is there a connection between those limits and the Standard & Poor's credit rating? Was my question.
I might start that and then maybe Brett might like to comment. There most certainly is, Councillor Stellinger, there is Standard & Poor's audit LGFA, they audit Auckland Council, other councils that are sustained AA ratings as well. They check all of that. They check your liquidity calculations and all of that. They're also looking at your forward forecasting in terms of whether they feel that you're still stable watch, negative watch. Negative watch doesn't necessarily mean they're going to downgrade you, but nevertheless, there is the possibility for that to occur. So it's very much part of that whole rigorous, and it is extremely rigorous to go through a Standard & Poor's credit rating review. It's very time consuming and experience. They will consider all of that. So they are definitely very much connected. There are, Auckland Council does also have another rating agency that they have a second check on theirs. But I'd certainly invite Brett to make his comments in terms of, I'm sure you've seen through the eyes of Standard & Poor's on other councils as well, Brett.
Yes, look, the credit rating of the LGFA at AA plus is important to the LGFA, not only in terms of its contribution to funding the local government sector, but also its responsibility to those investors that it's issued bonds to. So it's highly critical that that the LGFA maintains that AA plus rating, and there's a number of aspects that drive that AA plus rating. Not only the Crown support through the liquidity facility, but also just the quality of the loan portfolio. So there's an obligation really for those guaranteeing borrowers to have either a formal credit rating, which is pretty close to AA, or not too many of the council members having a credit rating below that, whether that's be formal or informal. So that's important, I suppose. So whatever the LGFA can control around what contributes to that very strong credit rating is they need to do. The only risk, I suppose, to the LGFA is if the sovereign credit rating falls below AAA, local, AA plus, foreign currency, then yes, unfortunately, it's a sinking lid. But yes, any change in those limits will be, from the LGFA's perspective, will be in discussion with S&P. And during COVID, for instance, a good example where they got the ability to increase that net debt to revenue ratio to 300% from 250%, but there's a step down requirement there. So when we get to, I think it's 2008, we're back down to 280%. So, and talking to S&P recently, it's a international peer measure. So they'll look at our local government sector and say, how indebted are we? And we're actually reasonably indebted compared to other peer councils globally. But the institutional framework gives us that step up, that gives us that AA plus rating. So that those limits are very much core to the success of the maintenance of that LGFA rating at AA plus. Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Stellinger. Good questions. Are there any further questions? Thank you. I'll then put the recommendations in front of you. There are 3, and they are that the subcommittee recommends that Council A approves the updated Treasury Risk Management Policy attached as Appendix 1 to the report. 2, notes the advice from PwC Treasury Advisors attached as Appendix 2 to the report. And 3, agrees that the review of the financial strategy borrowing limits will be completed as part of the long-term plan 2024-2034 process. May I have a seconder, please? Councillor Stellinger, thank you. Is there any member who would like to speak to the motion, please? No? Any member who would like to speak against the motion? Thank you. I'll then put the motion. All those in favour say aye, against say no. Thank you. Declare the motion carried, and thank both Brett and Cameron for your time. Thank you for joining us. I will now continue moving through our agenda. We are now moving to agenda item 9, which is the risk management and insurance update, which is on page 145 of the agenda pack. And I'd like to invite Nishana Reddy, the risk assurance manager, to speak to the report. Welcome, Nishana.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. So the paper before you today provides an overview of Council's strategic risk and our assurance and related activities that goes on within the risk and assurance function. We have 13 risks on the risk register. Previously, we had 14 when the register was last presented to the subcommittee in June 2022. All risks are rated overall residual risk rating of medium. Previously, we had 3 that was rated as high. So the workforce, capability and capacity risk, which is risk number 1, and the organizational resilience, previously known as COVID-19, has reduced the overall risk rating from high to medium, and that aligns with Council's confidence in the processes and practices we have in place, as well as the resources that has been allocated in order to deal with that risk. I move on into the assurance activity. So within the paper, you would notice I've included, we've revisited the internal audit plan. The internal audit plan has been revisited to align better with Council's risk profiling and our priorities, and to ensure we have value add to this Council. And business continuity planning is another part of the risk and assurance function. So we annually update these continuity plans, and that's currently in process, expected to be completed at the end of March. Happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nishana. Jenny, is there anything you'd like to add before we go to questions? No, thank you. Before I do open for questions, I'd just like to ask one question myself, and that is, given we do have a number of councillors who are new members of the committee, are you all comfortable with the terminology of the inherent risk and the residual risk on the register? Thank you. I just wanted to double check on that because it's something that can be interpreted in 2 ways unless you actually quite clearly understand that. So no, thank you. I appreciate you clarifying that. So I'll open for any questions that you may have. Councillor Stillinger, go ahead, please.
I've got a few, hopefully they're just fairly short ones. One which stood out for me just looking through the plan and the changes. I'm looking on page 148. Is the original plan included a review of development and financial contributions? And I see that's not continuing at the moment. I've just always found that to be, way back in my days of staff, especially in the early days when they're coming about, extremely complex process, legislation, and just trying to comply with the rules was very difficult. And I know back in those days we certainly didn't get it right always. So just a little bit concerned to see that moving down the order of priorities, I suppose, but I'm unaware of what other procedures or steps may have been taken recently or planned in the future to ensure we're doing all of that correctly. So I just wonder if there's any comment on that.
I'll make a comment because I'm pretty close to this from a finance perspective. So I suppose this initial audit plan was set up before we had our new DC policy. And, you know, through the LTP process, we did a full comprehensive review of our development contributions policy. We implemented new processes around our calculation of DCs and the sort of implementation of that new policy as well. So I suppose when we reviewed this policy now, we feel a lot more confident in the practices that we've got in place and the work that's had been done. And the value add from this audit is, you know, didn't feel like it, we had different problems back then when the audit plan was set up, or different concerns, and we feel like we've mitigated them now. The other thing is that through the external audit by Audit New Zealand, you know, they haven't picked up any other audit issues in relation to DC, so we're feeling pretty confident, and it's a low priority area currently. Another aspect, just in terms of the revenue recognition for DCs, we did a bit of work with Auckland Council around that revenue recognition, and we've improved the processes and practice in our policy there as well. So there's been quite a bit of work in the DC space, and we're feeling a lot more confident, and the need for this internal audit, we don't feel, you know, it's low risk now, and we'd rather put the time and energy into other items.
Thanks, Jenny. Are there any further questions? Councillor Stallinger, you indicated you had a few questions. Are you happy with? Okay, thank you. Well, I'm sure that the officers would be happy to answer those for you offline if needed. So I'll now put the recommendations to you, and they are that the subcommittee, these are quite lengthy, so please bear with me. 1, notes and receives the information in this report. 2, notes that there are 13 risks, previously 14, on the strategic risk register. 3, notes the risk relating to building consents accreditation has been removed from the register, with Hutt City Council's Building Consent Authority being reassessed as low risk per report dated 9 September 2022 from the International Accreditation of New Zealand, also known as IANZ. 4, notes the overall residual risk rating for the workforce capacity, capability, engagement risk and organisation resilience risk, previously named COVID-19, reduced to medium, which was previously high. 5, notes the risk register attached as Appendix 1 to the report. 6, notes the update on assurance and other activities. And 7, notes and receives the revised internal audit plan for 2022 and 2023. May I have a seconder, please? Thank you. Councillor Morgan. Is there any member who would like to speak to the motion, please? Councillor Stallinger.
Just to congratulate the officers, as I just did privately before, on the great quality of reporting here in relation to risks. I found it very impressive, and also just to congratulate the organisation on the good news we have in recommendation 3 in relation to the building consents accreditation.
Thank you, Councillor Stallinger. Duly noted, and I'm sure appreciated by everybody that's been involved. Is there any member who would like to speak against the motion, please? No? I'll then put the motion. All those in favour say aye, against say no. Thank you. Declare the motion carried. Thank you, Nishana, for all your good work. That takes us to item 10, which are the sensitive expenditure disclosures on page 169 of your agenda. And welcome back, Darren. You're having a busy afternoon. There are several disclosures here taking us back to April 2022. So, Darren, I'd just like to ask you just to introduce your report, please, and any comments you'd like to make.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I would just like to table this report. It does cover the last 3 quarters. Main reason for that is I was on secondment, and so now we're just in a catch-up mode, so they will be more frequent going forward. So the 3 quarters are attached to the report in Appendix 1 through 3. We've also included in this publication a link to the OAG website where it talks about sensitive expenditure. So if you're wanting to update any information on there or check on information there. And just to note that these returns will be published on our council website. No other comments.
Thank you, Darren. Jenny, is there any additional comment you'd like to make? No, thank you. We'll then open for any questions that Mr Mayor, councillors, any one of you may have. No, thank you. I'll then put the recommendations in front of you, and they are that the subcommittee 1 receives and notes the report, and 2 notes the sensitive expenditure disclosure information attached to the reports as A, Appendix 1, summary of sensitive expenditure on 1 April 2022 to 30 June 2022. B, Appendix 2, summary of sensitive expenditure 1 July 2022 to 30 September 2022. And C, Appendix 3, summary of sensitive expenditure 1 October 2022 to 31 December 2022. May I have a seconder, please? Councillor Briggs, thank you. Is there any member who would like to speak to the motion? No, thank you. Any member who would like to speak against the motion? Thank you. I'll then put the motion. All those in favour say aye, against say no. Thank you. Declare the motion carried. Thank you, Darren. Moving on, item 11 on our agenda, page 177 of our pack, is the Holidays Act Compliance Report, of which Jenny is going to introduce. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just very briefly, there's probably good and bad news in this project. You know, we've made some really good progress to date in terms of getting to getting all the calculations done up to the end of March 2022, paying out as many people as possible, both current staff and former staff. But we've got this issue with our moving to a new Holiday Act compliant payroll system, and that part of the project is having challenges and is largely on hold currently. And we've got Lyndon here, who's the project lead for that aspect. So we're doing as much as we can to get us ready, sort out the historical matter and prepare to move to the new system once we're there. So overall, good progress to date on that aspect, but we do have this challenge. And Lyndon, do you want to talk? Maybe just talk to the payroll piece briefly, just a bit of an overview. So yeah, that's the big challenge next. Yeah.
Sure, through you, Madam Chair. With regards to the payroll system, we had a project underway to replace the system with the selected provider, which was called Ceridian. We have, working with them, their current system is not compliant with the New Zealand Holidays Act. So we have met with them recently, and we're talking to them and having conversations with them about when they expect it to be compliant. And at this stage, we're still trying to understand the timeframe of that. And as soon as we have that, we'll report back to you. I think we've got in this paper reporting back in August. Is that correct? So we will come back in August and report where we're at in the process of getting that system compliant. And there was a component in that system that we wanted available to us, which is around position management as well. And that has been released, that has been released this month. So any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Lyndon. Before I open for questions, just a couple of additional comments I'd make. Firstly, just to put this into context, particularly for our new council members on the committee, this is an issue that practically every organisation in New Zealand has had to grapple with and is still grappling with. And you'll notice in the paper, paragraph 3, there's a comment there about an update from the Office of the Auditor General calculating central government's Holiday Act liability of $2.1 billion as at 30 June. So that sort of puts a little context around this issue. And to Lyndon's comment, what some of this the cause of some of this was very ambiguous wording in the Act, which then contributed to the second factor, which was actually that there was not a single payroll system in New Zealand that was compliant as a result of that, because the interpretation of the Act was so ambiguous that they were all done in different ways. So certainly in terms of making sure, I know as Jenny said at the outset, good news and bad news, you certainly do not want to implement a payroll system that is, again, not going to be compliant with the Act, otherwise you go back to square one. So I'd just like to make those two comments there. I'll now, having said all of that in the office's overview, invite any questions that you may wish to ask. Councillor Briggs, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Just for you, just around the communication piece with former staff and current staff. I take it there's been an ongoing dialogue around the transition at the moment and our current challenges, and so that they're well aware that we're actively doing what we can to resolve the issue, but there may be some delay.
Yeah, we've had a communications plan with a range of communications that have gone out. Internally, there's been, through the staff Pānui, communication. And in terms of the former staff, we've obviously communicated with them to make the payments that are owed to them on that. So that's been sort of the key components of that communication plan, and it'll continue as we work through this process, and we'll link in with the payroll project as well.
Thank you, Councillor Briggs, and thank you, Jenny. Are there any further questions? No, I'll then put the recommendations in front of you. They are lengthy, so please bear with me. That the subcommittee notes and receives the report being the 7th update on the Holidays Act remediation project, and notes the following. A, notes the remediation calculations were completed by a payroll calculation specialist in mid-July 2022, with the results providing a high level of confidence that the calculations are correct. B, notes the first tranche of payments to current staff owed remediation was made on 27 July 2022, covering the period from March 2015 to March 2022. C, notes the contact at the last known address of former staff entitled to remediation payments commenced in late July 2022, with an advertisement placed in the local newspaper on 11 August 2022. D notes that of the 1,098 former staff entitled to remediation payments, we have paid 62% and have 415 staff remaining to pay, equating to $266,000. E notes that the new HRIS and payroll system to be implemented as part of the Te Koho Go Digital program was to go live in mid-2022. However, the project is largely on hold as it's waiting for a software release from the vendor that contains functionality Hutt City Council requires and assurance the release is fully Holidays Act compliant before progressing the implementation. The new system is expected to go live in late 2023 to ensure Council is fully compliant with the Act. F notes that a further tranche of payments to impacted current staff will be required to cover the period from April 2022 until the date the Council achieves full compliance following the implementation of the new HRIS and payroll system, and is anticipated that this will be met by the contingency within the original provision made in the financial statements to 30 June 2021. And lastly, G notes that officers plan to report to the Audit and Risk Subcommittee on Holidays Act compliance on 29 August 2023, when there is expected to be further progress achieved regarding the implementation of a compliant payroll system. May I have a seconder, please? Thank you, Councillor Barrett. Is there any member who would like to speak to the motion? Councillor Stallinger.
Just to say I empathise with the staff in this situation. I briefly had a leadership responsibility for a remediation project. I was glad it was just a brief experience, and I was very glad to hand that over. I mentioned before about the complexities in development contributions and managing those. Well, this is a much more complex matter here, and so you know, I'm not surprised by the length of time, and I entirely agree with the any delays that are needed, that they be taken in order to get our systems right before we build another problem to be resolved down the track. So just want to thank the staff for all their efforts to try and sort this out.
Thank you, Councillor Stanger. I'm sure they appreciate that acknowledgement. It is highly complex, as you say, as well. Is there any member who would like to speak against the motion? No, thank you. I'll then put the motion. All those in favour say aye, against say no. Thank you. I declare the motion carried. Thank you, Lyndon, and thank you, Jenny. Moving on, we are now on to the information items in our pack. That is agenda item 12, and the first one of those on page 181 of your agenda is the 9i Projects Progress Update. I'd like to invite Andrew Quinn, the project manager, to speak to his memorandum. Good afternoon, Andrew. Thank you.
Tēnā koe, Madam Chair, tēnā koutou, Mr Mayor and councillors. This is the progress report for the 9i projects, being the 9i Pool and Fitness Centre and the conversion of 9i Post Office to Community Centre. Progress as at the end of January 2023, and last report was back in August 2022. So a fair bit has been accomplished by the project team in that period. I'd just like to note some of the key milestones of achievement in the summary and recommendation. All of our consents have been lodged, and 50% of those are approved for construction. Commencement of foundation slabs, and we're working on 75% of the total floor area, so that's really good progress, and that remaining 25% will be scheduled for the next few months. Off-site procurement, design activity and building consent processing is proceeding in line with the program that we agreed with co-founder Crown Infrastructure Partners. Procurement of the major items for the building are progressing to plan, and local suppliers are involved in the tendering process. That's really important for both team and contractor in these current climate. Design activity of the refurbishment of the old post office is complete. Building consent has been granted, and a contract now let with Duncan Commercial, who are also local to the Hutt Valley. And the cost of 9i Pool and Fitness Centre continues to be reviewed at regular intervals and remains within the $68 million budget cap. I'd just make one more note that the progress photographs that you see in the rear of the paper They were actually dated early February. In the last 2-3 weeks, significant progress has been made with precast elements now coming to site, and we're starting to see the project coming out of the ground. So really good to see that. The visit to off-site facilities in Levin was really good, and a couple of those pictures really just show the scale of the infrastructure that we're building. I think if you turn to page 185, attachment 2 shows a picture of the glulam timber beams that will span across the main pool. Those beams are 35 to 40 metres long, and they're actually turned on one side. So if you turn the photograph through 90 degrees, you get an impression of how deep and long the structure that we're building. It's a major project, and it's taking the competence of a major contractor like Apollo Projects with credibility in the supply chain management and the procurement of major items of plant. So we're really pleased with progress. Can I take the paper as read and take any questions?
Thank you very much, Andrew, and certainly great to see such terrific progress being made. And I personally find the photographs very helpful to visualise some of that. So thank you. Mr Mayor, councillors, do you have any questions? No? Thank you. I'll then put the recommendation to you, and that is that the subcommittee receives the memorandum and notes the following progress that has been made on the 9A projects. A, all of the required consents have been lodged with council and 50% of those approved for construction. B, commencement of foundation slabs and 75% of the total floor area underway. C, off-site procurement, design activity and building consent processing is proceeding in line with the program agreed with co-funder Crown Infrastructure Partners. D, procurement of the major components for the building are progressing to plan and local suppliers are involved in the tendering process. E, design activity for the refurbishment of the old 9A post office is complete. Building consent has been granted and a contract let with Duncan Commercial. And F, the cost for the 9A pool and fitness centre continues to be reviewed at regular intervals and remains within the $68 million budget cap. May I have a seconder, please? Thank you, Councillor Morgan. Is there any member who would like to speak to the motion? Councillor Morgan, please go ahead.
I just thought I needed to say something because I haven't said anything. No, just kidding. But I just actually want to say congratulations. This is really exciting. And I think the part that is really special about this project is using local companies and you know, building up the community and building up their mana and their value to this project. So there'll be real ownership in it. And I think that's so special. So ngā mihi kia koe. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Morgan. Appreciate those comments. I'm sure particularly of note to Andrew, and pass back to the team, please. Any further? No? Any member who'd like to speak against the motion? I'll then put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, say no. Thank you. Declare the motion carried. Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate your update. The second memorandum update that we have is item B, which is the Riverlink update on page 188 of our agenda. And I'd like to invite Tom Biggin, the project manager, to speak to the memorandum. Good afternoon, Tom.
Good afternoon, all. Yeah, just to draw your attention to a few matters in the report. Last year was a big year for us, getting a successful consent decision, which is great, and we're full steam ahead with our procurement process at the moment, looking to have our alliance partner on board from the end of next month, which is coming up very quickly. So that's really exciting. I think the chair suggested, given that we've got a few new committee members here, it'd be good to sort of just run through a few items on the risk register. So there's a few interrelated risks there, which are particularly pertinent at this point in time when we're getting our delivery partners on board and trying to plan out the project. So escalation is a key risk, as we know, for the entire industry. And there's program implications for that. So as we move through the next 6 months, we'll get a good understanding of what the delivery program looks like, and then we'll be able to take stock of escalation and how we manage that risk. And then obviously linked to that, there are funding risk items that we need to consider as we move forward. So happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Tom. Mr Mayor, councillors, do you have any questions? Councillor Stellinger?
Two, if I may. First one is just one of my ignorance. What is the IPAA?
Once you've got our alliance partners on board, we have an interim agreement with them. So IPAA stands for Interim Project Alliance Agreement. So we have an agreement which essentially allows us to work through design, project planning, programming and construction estimation with them. And then once we've reached that stage, then we sign them up to a project alliance agreement, which is then to deliver all of that work.
Go ahead, Councillor Stallinger, your second one.
The second one, yeah, is probably a bit more substantive, but you partially spoke to this before, so excuse me, just trying to catch up a bit. It's to do with the risk of cost escalation. And it seems almost inevitable to me, just given what we've experienced on other major projects, that as we move down the track in the current market, costs are going up to a very large degree. Is there much flexibility from at least the Hutt City Council's point of view or side of the project, or those things we are funding, to modify or tweak the plans, the extent of them, without losing the essence of the project, should we need to, in the case of escalation?
Yeah, that's essentially the process we need to go through in the next 6 months, really, is that obviously we secured the LTP approval in 2021, so that's some time ago now, but the objectives are still the same. So the next 6 months is really working with our preferred team to work out how we achieve all the great outcomes that we've secured in the consent within the budget that we've secured in 2021. Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Stallinger, and thank you, Tom, for those responses. Are there any further questions? No, thank you. I'll then put the recommendation in front of you, and that is that the subcommittee, 1, receives the report and notes the content, and 2, in particular, notes the Environment Court's positive decision for the resource consent and praise for all parties involved in the consenting process. That is a significant step for Council. So I think it does duly warrant being in the recommendations for this report. May I have a seconder, please? Thank you, Councillor Stallinger. Is there any member who would like to speak to the motion? Any member who'd like to speak against the motion, please? No, thank you. I'll then put the motion. All those in favour say aye, against say no. Thank you. Declare the motion carried. Thank you, Tom, for your update and all of your good work. The last report on our agenda, Mr Mayor and Councillors, is the Audit and Risk Subcommittee Forward Work Programme for this calendar year, which is on page 195 of the agenda. This is a report that is in every Audit and Risk Committee subcommittee agenda pack, and it just merely is there to help you, plus myself and the officers, know which reports we should expect to the committee. Obviously, that can change. We may add additional reports from time to time, but that will give you a good outline of what you should expect to see coming through this committee for this calendar year. Does any, Mr Mayor and Councillors, do you have any specific questions on that? It's really forward planning for you all. No, it's quite straightforward, but I'm sure if there are any, either Jenny or one of the other officers, Catherine, one of the democracy team would ask that, or certainly I'm happy to answer that as well. So I'll then put the recommendation, which is simply that the subcommittee receives and notes the forward program for 2023 attached as Appendix 1 to the memorandum. May I have a seconder, please? Thank you, Councillor Briggs. I'll then put the motion. All those in favour say aye, against say no. Thank you. I declare the motion carried. That takes us to any questions. I've received no written questions or requests for this meeting. And before I ask Councillor Briggs to again take us through the closing karakia this time, I'd just like to obviously acknowledge the weather events that have occurred, the Auckland floods, some of my family were impacted by that, and Cyclone Gabrielle, which is just devastating. And I did receive the memo about the bright colour, so I'm normally perhaps a little more subdued in my address, but team player, I joined in and I have very gladly made my donation. So appreciate being invited to join in. Councillor Briggs, would you please take us through the closing karakia?
With pleasure, Chair. Everyone do feel free to join in as well. Unu hia, unu hia. Unu hia e te urutapu nui, kia wātea, kia māma, te nākau, te tinana, te wairoa i te ara takatū. Koia rā e runga, whakahiria ake ki runga, kia wātea, ai rā, ko wāte, hau, pai marere.
Thank you very much, Councillor Briggs. I'll declare the meeting closed at 3:10 p.m. Thank you very much, Mr Mayor, councillors, for your attendance, and also officers and our external guests. Stay safe, everybody. There is a little bit more nasty weather coming by the look of it. And mā te wā. Thank you.